Thank you very much, Peter. A very warm introduction. I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you bearing with me to do a little talk about how we're doing and what we're doing concerning Ukraine and the division of the country and trying to get the territory back and trying to make sure Ukraine is successful. Peter, as he mentioned, is a very good friend, and SIPA has done just a remarkable job. And so I want to praise SIPA and all of you for supporting SIPA. I think they have done tremendous work in raising the profile of the issues of Central and Eastern Europe and Europe more broadly in Washington. They've done a great job of bringing the right people together. And I think that there is a lot more that SIPA is going to do in the future that will make a difference. And so I'm really very pleased to see that and very honored to be here. I thought the way I would organize some thoughts about talking about Ukraine would be to keep it simple and just talk about what have we done, what have we not done, and what do we have to do. And so I'll start with what have we done. And I'm going to start with maybe something that will be a little bit surprising to you, but I think one of the most important things that we have done is change the language, change the way we talk about what's happening in Ukraine. Over the past year, or if you go more than a year ago, I think there was a great deal of obfuscation, great deal of making concerted efforts to paper over Russia's responsibility for the conflict in Ukraine. When I first started in the job, I was shown a map. And this map had an acronym on it in the eastern part of Ukraine, and it said NGCA. And I was thinking, what is NGCA? And then it was explained to me, this is non-government controlled area. And I thought, why on earth would anyone say that? Why don't we just say what it is? It's the Russian-controlled area. You have a Ukrainian-controlled area and a Russian-controlled area. And that's what we're talking about. Similarly, there had often been, especially in the media, but also in diplomatic circles, references to separatists, to ethnic conflict, to civil war, to civil strife, to political grievances. And it's important there not to go down that road either. It's very important to say that the conflict in Ukraine, the eastern part there that is occupied by Russia, is 100% under Russian command and control. So you have a military force with Russian generals at the top of it, and military officers embedded at every level of command down to the company level. You have two political entities that were created by Russia and are financed by Russia, and the leadership is selected by Russia, and they operate at the direction of Russia. And these are the so-called Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republics. And they are there as a device for Russia to avoid responsibility. And too often we were falling into the trap of talking about them as if they were real, or talking about them as if they were negotiating entities or partners in some way. And it's very important that what we did from the United States perspective is to address Russia directly and say we want to talk with Russia. Russia's the decision maker. We want to negotiate a peace in Ukraine. We want to see a withdrawal of Russian forces, and you can only negotiate that with Russia. That has been a huge change, and I think it has had a lot of trickle-down effects that have been significant. But what else have we done? That's one thing that we've done, but what else have we done? We have maintained U.S. sanctions and increased them gradually over time. So there was a lot of concern or suspicion that with the new administration, the Trump administration, there would be a lack of interest in keeping pressure on Russia or a desire to unwind sanctions. The opposite is true. This administration has increased sanctions on Russia because of its actions in Ukraine, as well as because of Russia's other actions on closing down diplomatic facilities or attempting to poison former agents in the UK and so forth. We've also worked very, very closely with our European allies, especially France and Germany, and that has helped keep European sanctions in place. And I think this is one of the things that has been very surprising to President Putin, is that European resolve and sanctions have been as strong and steady over 4 years as they have been. There are always efforts to try to change these, But those efforts have thus far been unsuccessful, and it's our hope, together with France and Germany and other key European partners, to keep those sanctions there. And I believe that they are making a difference. I think they are touching people who are influential in Russia. They are causing President Putin to have to watch his internal situation more, and I think we have to keep at that as well. Another thing we've done is lift the arms embargo on Ukraine. We had in place, as you know, a ban on sales of lethal defensive equipment to Ukraine. I never understood it, and working within the Trump administration, we were able to see that ban lifted. And we provided Javelin anti-tank weapons and financed the purchase of anti-sniper systems. And this is not just about a decision about those systems, it's a decision about Ukraine as a country. We recognize Ukraine as a country that is defending itself. Self-defense is a right of any country. It's enshrined in the UN Charter. And we are going to treat Ukraine like any other country, meaning we have foreign military financing programs that work their way through the Congress. We have foreign military sales. They have legitimate national security strategy and defense needs, and we'll talk with them about them and see where we can be helpful along the way. So it's a normal defense relationship now, as opposed to one that had been singularized against Ukraine. Another is Secretary Pompeo on July 25th issued a formal declaration of U.S. policy on the non-recognition of Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea. This Pompeo declaration is a deliberate statement trying to make permanent U.S. policy, and it explicitly references the Wells Declaration of 1940, where this was done concerning the Baltic states. And that's significant as well, because at the time when the Wells Declaration was issued, nobody really knew whether it was significant, how significant it would be, what it meant in practice. But we learned many, many, many years later that it was a hugely important step. And so we wanted to take a step now on Ukraine to say we are viewing Russia's claimed annexation of Crimea exactly the same way. We don't accept it, and we won't accept it. I could go on in a few other areas as to what we have done. We certainly work closely with the Ukrainian government, and we've seen some significant reforms implemented, including the creation of the Anti-Corruption Court, the implementation of a pension reform that is very good for the budget in the long term, implementation of an education reform, implementation of healthcare reform. There are bumps along the way. There are problems. There are issues. I see the Hungarian ambassador here, and we need Hungary and Ukraine to work some things out. But overall, I think Ukraine has done a reasonably good job in putting through some reforms. Let me now turn to what we haven't done. What we have not done is cause Russia to change its position. We have not caused Russia to decide to withdraw its forces, to decide to make peace, to decide to stop shelling Ukrainians every night. Russia still believes that it gets an advantage out of being there. We've tried to demonstrate that that's false. And in fact, I make the argument, a couple of them, I think they're very important. One of them is that it is only the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukrainian territory that has caused Ukraine to become more unified, more nationalist, more Western-oriented, and more Russia-skeptic than ever before. And that is especially true in a younger generation of Ukrainians who only see Russia as an aggressor against Ukraine, and they have no desire to see Ukraine permanently affiliated with Russia in some way. So Russia has lost in its principal strategic objective. And the best way to stop the bleeding on that particular objective would be to pull out, but they are not willing to do so yet. The other point that I think is important to make is that Russia, through the Minsk agreements, claims that it supports the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and through its public pronouncements, claims that it supports safety and security of Russian-speaking people inside Ukraine. It is very important to point out that the only place in Ukraine, a vast country with a large Russian-speaking population throughout the country, the only place where Russian-speaking people are facing crises, where they're facing lack of security and lack of access to goods and essentials, is where the Russian forces are. And so if Russia cares about these people the way it says it does, then again, it should have an interest in pulling out. So we have put on the table, one of the things we've done, again, we've put on the table a proposal for how to get out of the deadlock, which is to have a UN-mandated peacekeeping mission come and take security in this contested area, hold that territory while political steps under the Minsk agreements are implemented. And then once implemented, that culminates with Ukraine having the territory back and control of the international border. So that is what we've put on the table. Now, what we have not done, we've not gotten Russia to change its mind. We've not gotten Russia to agree to a peacekeeping mission. We've not gotten Russia to lay off the pressure. And in fact, I think we are in a period of time now where Russia is looking at the Ukrainian elections coming up for the presidency in March and for the parliament next fall, and wanting to wait it out and see what happens. It knows it's not going to get any concession to Russian-controlled territory, to accepting these two people's republics, to a permanent division of the country, to a veto over Ukraine's foreign policy orientation. It's not going to get those concessions from the current government. And so it's willing to just wait it out and see what happens with the next government. I think that, again, is wishful thinking on the part of Russia, because the country has changed so much that no politician in Ukraine could accept any of those things and get away with it publicly. The public has moved to a point where those are unacceptable positions. So that's what we've done and what we haven't done. And the next thing I want to say is, well, what do we have to do? The most important thing to do is to help make sure that Ukraine is a successful country. And that means a democracy, a market economy, the rule of law that is not crippled by corruption, that is not crippled by an oligarchic system, that has security, and that is anchored in Europe and the transatlantic community. That's the most important thing to have happen. And we all have a role to play in helping. No doubt, Ukraine plays the largest role. It must make the right decisions. It must tackle these issues itself. But they do need a lot of international attention and support. And that is an area where I think we should all be focused and all contributing. We can speak out, we can use clear language, we can keep proposals on the table, we can keep sanctions in place, we can support the Ukraine's modernization of its armed forces, and we must support Ukraine's political and economic maturization. And then final point that I would make, which is to broaden and pick up actually some of the themes of this conference and why people are here. It's also to remember that Ukraine matters not only for its own sake, but Ukraine matters to us. Ukraine is at a critical geography, a critical cultural fissure, a critical political economic fissure within Europe. If Ukraine emerges successfully as a secure market democracy, as part of a transatlantic community, it is a tremendous step forward for safeguarding those values for the entire European continent, and ultimately an inspiration for the Russian people as well, that this is achievable. If the opposite happens, if Ukraine is sucked down by corruption and incompetence and Russian aggressive activity and pulled into a Russian orbit, it means that we, the transatlantic community, are going to have a very long struggle over these issues and over these values in Europe for decades to come. And none of us want that, so we should be wanting to help Ukraine succeed. So I will pause there. Thank you very much for having me here, and I'd love to answer any questions and address any comments.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this very insightful and very important discussion that we were really looking forward to. We very much appreciate that you graciously allowed for a question at least to follow the presentation. So if I may ask Brian maybe to use that one opportunity that we have, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Brian Whitmore, Senior Fellow and Director of the Russia Program here at SIPA. And I wanted to pick up on your last point about effectively what is at stake in Ukraine, because as we don't have to tell everybody in this room, any Russian imperial project begins with Ukraine, but it certainly doesn't end with Ukraine. But nevertheless, despite what's at stake, a lot of people do still view Ukraine as a faraway country of which we know little. And what more do we need to do to further this narrative that Ukraine is actually very important, very vital, and very central to our security? Thank you.
That's a great question. And the reason that you're asking it is because we haven't done a good job at this. And I say Ukraine hasn't done a good job at this. I think there are a couple things. One of them is the wider community of transatlanticists and Ukrainian Americans need to be engaging in our political system. I see Radek over here, and he reminds me that during the 1990s, the Central European Coalition, which was the coalition of all the ethnic groups who were affected by the possibility of NATO enlargement, Hungarian Americans, Czech Americans, so forth, they were very, very active politically. And the Clinton administration flipped from being against NATO enlargement to being pro-NATO enlargement because Bob Dole came out in favor of NATO enlargement, and the Clinton administration didn't want to get trumped by that. So they came out in favor of NATO enlargement too, going into the 96 election. So then you had a situation where no matter who won, the US policy was from that point forward going to be in favor of NATO enlargement. So I think engaging politically is one thing, both an ethnic community as well as this transatlantic community. Another thing that I think is important is to encourage Ukraine to improve the climate for foreign investment. It is a deterrent situation right now. Foreign investors feel that they will not get a fair deal, or they have to deal with unsavory business partners that are mandated in order for them to be able to do business. And that's an unhealthy relationship, and that trickles back through the business community to the political community. So I think making sure that we have successful foreign investment in Ukraine from a transatlantic community is also important. And then one of the final factor I'll mention on this, and I was talking about it with the Deputy Foreign Minister from Czech Republic earlier today, I think that we all of us, need to help work with Ukraine on changing the nature of its political economic system. You have a system now where about 5 or 6 people dominate the economy, and as a result dominate politics and media and everything else. And this is the source of the deterrent effect against foreign investment, and it's the source of corruption being a tool within that system. So I think what Ukraine needs to be looking at, with help from the US, the EU, the IMF, is antitrust legislation to break up business empires. People don't go to jail, they sell their assets, they keep them, and they don't go to jail. But you create competition and you create rules. And I think if Ukraine is able to do that over a several-year period, it's going to be the most fundamental change and the most beneficial change the country could implement. So, thanks, Brian. I mean, do one more because it's so short. I mean, one more. Yes, in the middle there.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. My name's Dan Albahazi. I'm a DoD civilian, but just recently returned from a one-year advising assignment in Kyiv in Deputy Prime Minister Ivana Klimbushinzadze's office. So Ukraine's near and dear to my heart. I'm just interested in your thoughts on the presidential election next year.
Right. So you can get me going in long or short form. But the first thing is, let's talk about the position of the United States. The United States cannot and should not personalize the politics of elections in a democratic country. What we need to do is make clear what are the values and principles that we stand for, and to articulate those consistently with everybody, privately, publicly, across the spectrum, and to work with whoever the Ukrainian people choose on that set of principles and values. And we may agree more or we may agree less, but the people are going to have to choose who they want to take. Now, a couple other thoughts beyond that. One of them is Russia is deeply engaged in trying to influence these elections. And that needs to be exposed. I think the best tonic for Russian influence is exposure of that influence. And that's an important thing, and we can help with that. And we even have some things we were talking to the Ukrainian government about to help with that. When I was in Kiev last week, Jared Cohen from Google was there, and he also had ideas as to help expose some of these things. Another factor is that the society has changed in 4 years since the Maidan. You could have said 4 years ago, Ukraine's a largely divided country. There's a pro-Russian side of things. There's some Ukrainian nationalism. There's a lot of apathy, and it doesn't really have a sense of national identity. And politicians can, manipulate that, and you'll have a contest between East and West. Not anymore. There's no politician who can adopt a position that is against integration with the West, that is accepting of Russia's intervention and occupation, or that is tolerant of corruption. There is no politician who can adopt any of those positions. So they are competing when they talk about how better to align with the West. And that's a very good position for the Ukrainian people and a very good position for us to be in as well. It is a long way off. It's March and we're 6 months away. And yet it is intense as if the election is next week. That everything in the media and everything going on is about the election in some way. That's probably healthy. And in contrast to Russia, where we knew the outcome of the election 6 years in advance, in Ukraine, we don't know the outcome 6 months in advance. So I think that's a good statement about the state of Ukraine's democracy at this point. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you for that.